All right, how's it going, everyone? So I wanted to have a little chat about what would you kind of expect during a coding interview. I've been making some little like React interview challenge problems, which I think are good practice, but I don't think they fully reflect how the interview process works because a lot of people won't even be asked to build React applications. They'll be asked to build like leak code, solving leak code problems and stuff. And some companies won't even ask you coding questions. They'll just ask you technical questions. And if you answer them kind of strangely, or if they can kind of sense you don't know what you're talking about, then you probably won't get the job, right? So I want to kind of talk about my experience and give you some context of like how much have I done interviews and how much have I conducted interviews myself. So I'll say that I've only been in like 2 or 3 interviews, honestly. Like the first interview I got out of college, I basically accepted the offer, right? I did one interview and accepted the offer. And that interview consisted of, I don't think I had any coding challenges, honestly. The people who interviewed me did know me already. So like, I don't think they really wanted to judge my coding experience. And also I was fresh out of college. So they probably knew that I wouldn't know how to code. That seems to be a common practice when you graduate from college. People don't really understand how to code that well, which is kind of weird. At least that's the experience that I've seen. So they asked me a bunch of personality questions, basically just like getting to know me, getting to see if I would be a good fit for their company or the project that I'd be on, getting to understand like what are some things that I worked on. I think some of the questions they asked me are like, talk about some projects that you worked on, or like, why do you enjoy coding? What do you find cool about computer vision, stuff like that. And they kind of gauge like my responses and just kind of make sure that I'm enthusiastic about what I'm trying to do. So I think that's one type of coding interview you'll get into. And also like I met with a bunch of different people during that. So like it was like it's like a full day interview. I met with a bunch of different people. And I think at the end of that interview, like everyone kind of, gives you a thumbs up or a thumbs down if they like the person that they're trying to hire. But again, that was at a larger corporation. And I would say that different companies have different perspectives of like what they want for a junior engineer. If you're trying to interview at a startup, they don't have as much money, which means that bringing on someone who doesn't know how to code is a lot more riskier. Because when you bring someone onto a team, you typically have to like onboard them, you have to train them. It takes them a couple months before they're even productive. And as a startup, you got to move fast, you got to ship features, you got to fix bugs. So I think at a startup, like your interview process may be a little bit more intense, I guess. They want to make sure that, when you join the team, you can start contributing like from the get-go. At least that's my perspective. Again, this is all my perspective. Call me out in the comments if I say anything that you think is wrong. I'm down to chat about it. But a larger corporation, again, that's where I was interviewing what I just talked about. They have a lot more money, right? So they can risk hiring someone who's like not that great. They can risk hiring someone who has potential but doesn't know what they're doing right now because they expect you to stick around for a couple of years or even longer so that they can train you and bring you up to speed with their processes and kind of get you to fit their cultural ways from the get-go, which is probably why they didn't really ask too many technical questions on that. And then you have like mid-sized companies which might do a mix of both. So after working in the company for like a year and a half, I decided to leave, and then I started looking for some new jobs. And I got 2 more interviews shortly after leaving. So one of them was at a company that my brother and my dad worked at. That interview was a little different as well because I think I was trying to get into a position that was probably way over my head. First of all, they did a phone interview, so someone from the company called me and just asked me some random questions. At this point, I don't remember what they asked me. I think they asked me some questions about databases and SQL and stuff, which honestly, I don't know if I even answered those questions right. And I think the only reason I was getting that interview is because both my dad and my brother worked at the company, so I had connections. I guess I passed the phone interview. They liked talking to me, I guess. And then after the phone interview, I got pulled into a real interview. And this one consisted of sitting in front of a panel of 3 people. So it was me at the one end of the table, and then there's 3 other developers on the other end of the table. And they basically just asked me random questions, just like explain to me, like, what did you work on your other company? Do you know much about Angular? Do you know much about web development stuff? And honestly, I barely knew anything about web development. I really didn't even know I was there. But so that was like the first panel of people. And then I remembered I had to interview with another 3 people. So those 3 people left, and then a new 3 people came in and interviewed me as well. So I had to talk to them and kind of do the same spiel, I believe. And then after that, I met with like another person, and we had like a one-on-one talk. Now that I think about it, I don't know why they interviewed me with so many people. Like that interview process seemed kind of ridiculous. Um, I think also there was an interview with one person who was just me and him in a room, kind of like talking. And I think he was an actual like member of the team or the project I would be on. So I guess like they had just random people from the company make sure that I'm a good fit for the company, and then they had people from the project verify that I'm good. I would be good for the project. And he asked me like a question about designing a blog database. So I had to actually like draw out an ER diagram and like show the many to many relationships or one to many and draw all the diagram stuff. There wasn't really a coding interview per se, but it was more of like a design interview. And again, this is after I've been working for like a year and a half, so I don't think they care too much about like can I code. It's more like do you know higher level topics and can you talk about them. So again, I'm just sharing you my experiences with interviewing, and this is like 2013, 2015, so it was a long time ago. I don't know if things have changed since then. They probably haven't, honestly. But at around the same time, another company called me. This was like a recruiter, and he called and he's like, "Hey, I got a position for you for an Angular web development position. I think you might be interested, but before I kind of get you a real interview with the company, I want to pre-screen you and just ask you some questions." And he asked me one question. He asked me to explain like what a promise is, and I gave an answer, but it's very like wishy-washy. I'm like, "Oh, I think a promise is like a way to like run some code and then later on you can do something with the results," which is a correct answer. But the way I presented myself on the phone, he actually stopped the interview right there. And he's like, "Look, I don't think you have enough confidence to interview at this other company I'm trying to get you into. So I recommend that you practice and I'll call you back in like a month or so." That was literally the phone interview, which is good, solid advice. And I took that advice seriously and I started just buckling down and learning as much as I could about JavaScript and like web development stuff. And he called me back a month later and I actually got a real interview at the current company I'm working now. So the interview I got at the company that I'm currently working, what they had me do was a take-home assignment, which you'll see sometimes in coding interviews where they give you like a prompt to build out a really basic application using whatever technologies that either that team wants you to use, or sometimes they give you the flexibility to pick what you want. So in my scenario, they said build a really simple quiz app. Like so it has like a question and it has 4 answers you can click. Build that, and then once you get through a certain amount of questions, go to like an end screen. And then they gave you like a bunch of like bonus scenarios, like if you add testing to your project, like that's a bonus. If you write your project in CoffeeScript, that's a bonus. So I definitely did all the bonus extra credit things, which I think helped a lot. And that took me like 2 to 3, 4 hours maybe to kind of all code out. Again, if you're doing like a take-home assignment, I would not spend more than like 4 hours on it, because at that point, like the employer doesn't really care too much about your time. But also, I think there's people out there who are like would refuse to do take-home assignments, which we see all the time, which is crazy because if you really want a job and you want to get paid money, like you should probably just do the take-home assignment, right? Like why limit your options if you think you're too good for a take-home assignment? I think it just shows that you have a bad character. Because honestly, some of these assignments, especially if you're good, like they shouldn't take you more than like 2 hours to do. And who can't find 2 hours during like a full week to work on one of these things? But after doing that take home assignment, basically they pulled me into a virtual interview, and I had to explain my code and walk them through my code. And I think what they're trying to do is gauge like, do I know how to talk about code? Do I know how to explain my code? Do I know what I'm talking about? And they kind of quizzed me on a couple things about my code, like why didn't I do this? There's one scenario where like the end page was super basic. I didn't style it at all. I just had like some text and that's it. And they kind of pointed that out. They're like, "Hey, so like I noticed that your end page in your Angular app like didn't really look finished. Like what happened? Did you just not have enough time?" And I said, "Well, it's because you didn't specify in the requirements for the project that this should do anything, right?" And that response, like I thought it was just a generic response, but that response I think actually got me the job. The fact that I mentioned that like the business requirements of your little take-home assignment did not specify what I need to do, and I shouldn't waste time building something that I don't know if you guys want or not, that just showed that I actually understand like how agile processes work and how business works. And I think that actually helped me land the job just from that simple answer. And I find it funny because most of the interview, it's actually the people who I was interviewing with talked the entire time. Like they were kind of like explained the project to me the majority of the time. And they didn't even ask me that many questions, which I found pretty interesting. But anyway, I ended up getting a job there, and I've been working there for like 7 years. So I do like the company other than that. But there's a lot of different things that you might see during an interview. I'll be honest, I've never been asked a coding challenge on an interview. I literally haven't. Some companies do this. They'll find you a leak code question. They'll ask you to do leak code. Some of the things I've been doing on my channel have been like little React challenge questions. Now, the reason we ask these is because there's some people who are really good at memorizing terms in React and JavaScript, but then when you tell them to solve a problem, they don't know how to do it, right? Like you can sit there and you can memorize the use effect. Like, what is use effect? Oh, well, it's a way to basically run a side effect in React. Yeah, but do you actually understand how to use it, right? So it's good to actually see someone code. And I think this is one of the most important ones, honestly. Some people online seem like they get really butthurt about coding interviews when they have to do late code challenges. But at the end of the day, like, you need to prove that you know how to code, right? You need to actually show an employer who's about to drop $80,000, at least in the US, $80,000 a year for your salary. And if you can't code, why would they hire you? It's like you hire a roofer for your house who doesn't know how to take shingles off a roof, right? You kind of have to prove that you know what you're doing. And there's no licensing behind like software engineering, right? There's not a license like a nurse where you have to pass a certain test to verify you can actually do your job. With engineering, there's no tests like that, which is why I think it's good to do coding interviews, because you can actually see how well can they interact with their IDE? How well can they type code? How good are they at editing code? How good are they at problem solving? Now, I know a lot of these leak code questions are really like abstract and they don't really seem like they apply to real life scenarios, but I do think they are still good questions that kind of flex your problem solving skills. So I know a lot of people hate leak code questions, but I do think they're a good way to like screen out candidates to see if they actually know how to problem solve. But I would rather have a question that's more related to like what you're doing. Like if you're getting interviewed for a React position, then yeah, I'd probably expect to get a coding challenge that was related to React, maybe integrating with an API or doing some type of, intermediate complex logic using React. So system design, that's the one that I mentioned where I had to do like an ER diagram. Depending on your level, like I think if you're more senior, then yeah, you're probably going to have to be able to sit down and draw out diagrams and explain like, oh, in this scenario, I'd use Amazon S3 to store all my files. And then I would use Lambda because it's cheap and it's fast. And I put Lambda behind an API gateway, and you draw circles between API gateway and Lambda. And you'd be like, oh, well, in this one scenario, I need an asynchronous process. So I'd set up an SQS queue and have Lambda fire an event to SQS queue. And I'd fan that out to many Lambdas. And then when those are all done, I basically reduce those into a single Lambda to process the results. Right, so knowing how to talk with system design is good, and how to like draw out larger systems that are resilient and fault tolerant. I haven't done an interview like this other than that little ER diagram thing I had to do with like a database schema. But I think understanding this is probably more important for the more skill that you have, the more senior that you become, or the position that you're going for. Hiring manager, I'm going to skip that one. I don't even know what that one is. Values. Yeah, this one's important. So a lot of companies want to verify that, like, are you a good person, or are you like an arrogant developer, right? I don't want to hire someone on my team who's arrogant and thinks they know everything and they think that their opinion is right every single time. I want someone who's humble. I'd rather hire someone who's humble and friendly over someone who's experienced. Because someone who's humble and friendly, you can actually collaborate with them. You can work with them. You can actually bounce ideas off of them, and you can make a better system. Versus if you're working with someone who thinks they're always right, it's just their way or the highway. It's like, I don't want that type of person on my team. And I'd rather hire someone who just can't code, but they're fun to work with and easy to work with, than someone who's like a coding guru who just doesn't take advice and is just unfriendly. Values and personality, those are important in interviews, and honestly, I think they're more important than the coding challenges themselves, because yeah, knowing how the code is good, but showing that you're motivated and you're energetic and you're positive and you're willing to like put in the effort to learn are much more important traits, in my opinion, than showing that you know how to code. But again, different companies had different expectations and different cultures as well. I think some cultures, like, they just want to know that you can code. They don't care about your values. They don't care about like, are you friendly? They just need to know that you can code and churn out code. So it definitely depends on the company you're interviewing with, and the culture of where you live, and like, what is the work ethic of where you live. I think India might have some different work ethics than America, so there's some differences. Remember, everything I say in my videos, this is coming from an American's perspective. I've been working in America for like almost 10 years now, so I have a different perspective than other countries. Prior experience, yeah, it's good to kind of, I've been asked this, so like talk about your prior experiences, talk about one time that you had to solve a really hard production issue, and like you'd have to go and answer that question for the interviewer. Or give me a time when you had to take on some extra responsibility and you went up and beyond what your company asked you. Okay, and then you have to like give out some generic response to that. So he's saying that this one's less common. Talking about prior experiences. I don't know why this would be less common. I think it's good to talk about things and problems you solved on your previous company and project. Because there's a ton of things that you probably did, and that's important information to know about. History is important, right? Just knowing that they can solve the problem is not as important as like knowing the history of what got them to where they're at. Like, did they ever encounter a scenario where their entire production site went offline? Like, how did they resolve that? What was their mindset when that happened? How did their team operate when that happened? Understanding, like, did they used to work in an agile mindset? Did they work with Scrum? Did they work with Kanban? Did they work with Waterfall? All these questions are important in my opinion. Like, on your previous company, did you write tests? Do you know how to write integration tests and unit tests? Did you do load testing? Did you do accessibility testing? Did you do lighthouse scores, etc.? Did you work with designers or UX or a product owner? These are all important to ask, so I don't know why you put less common. So task-based is another one this guy's saying. He's saying that it can either be a take-home project for a phone screen or an on-site. Yeah, so that's kind of like what I talked about my current job is what we did, where you have a small little take-home assignment that you should complete within like 4 hours, and then we kind of talk about it after you're done. And we look through your code and see, like, does the code seem clean? Was the code tested? Did the interviewee add unit tests even though we didn't ask for unit tests, right? If you go up and beyond with these take-home assignments and you add things that they didn't ask for, like testing, I don't know, Husky pre-checks, linting, whatever, it just shows that you're more like, you know what you're doing, right? Code review. I'm not sure what the code review is. You may be presented with some existing code and asked to either provide feedback or improve it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess this one would be okay. Reading through some code and like kind of explain, like, do you know what this code does? Can you find a bug that exists in this code? How would you refactor this code? Again, it's good to like talk about the actual code if that's like your main role is writing code, because you want to know that the person can point out poorly written code bases or poorly written functions, and how can they refactor functions? Can they point out magic numbers? Do they know what drying up code is? Do they know what the solid principles are, etc.? Can they apply those solid principles to function in code that they see, and kind of talk about those? And one thing I didn't talk about, this will be the last point I talk about, is I've helped conduct some interviews as well. Honestly, I was never like the lead conductor. I don't really care to interview people, to be honest. It's just not something I'm interested in. But I've helped out. And some tips I would give people who are interviewing is make sure you seem like you're enthusiastic about the job and the position and what you're doing, right? I've seen people come into interviews and they talk super monotoned. They don't seem like they're interested in the position. They don't ask questions. This is important. After the interview's done and we say, do you have any questions you want to ask us as a company? You should have a lot of questions. You should be able to ask about what type of tests you guys do. What is your process? Do you guys do Agile or Scrum? If I were to work at your company, what are some areas that I could potentially get some free resources in? Like, am I allowed to go to conferences? Do you guys pay for those? Am I allowed to basically buy books and expense those to you? What do you guys do in terms of like self-improvement? So anything that you think would be really important to know if you're about to work at that company. What is the team size? How many developers am I going to be working with every day if I were to join your company? What exactly is my role if I were to join your company? You should have a lot of questions lined up, and if you don't, that's kind of usually a telltale sign that the person either just doesn't care or they just weren't really prepared for the interview. And again, like I said, like, have some energy behind the interview. Usually the interviews last like an hour. And if you come acting like you're tired or you're like monotone or you're unenthusiastic, it really doesn't reflect you that well, right? Like, I don't want to work with someone who's just like here to do their job. I want to see someone who's motivated, who is enthusiastic about coding, who's enthusiastic about joining my project and my team. Because if I'm going to be working with you every day, I want you to be someone who's enjoyable to work with. So make sure you're friendly during the interviews. And a little trick, honestly, I'll tell you this trick. I don't know if I should even tell you this, but I took some caffeine pills before my interviews. Before the interview, I would pop a caffeine pill, which is the same as drinking like a large cup of coffee. So don't think it's like super bad, but just so that like you have this extra energy and this extra oomph that like really sells yourself. Because if you come in just looking exhausted, like, it just doesn't sell very well. But other than that, I'll put a link to this article if you guys want to read through it. I just wanted to have something to kind of reference as I talked about these. But if you enjoyed this little talk about interviewing and like what you might expect and what I've done in the past and what I've seen in my career, let me know. Leave me a thumbs up. Leave a comment below if you what have your experiences been during interviews? I want to kind of understand like where you guys have come from when you guys take interviews or when you guys are in interviews, because I know every company does these completely differently. And I have some people on my Discord who've been asking me for help during interviews because they're getting asked like really, really dumb questions. Like, for example, can you explain the node event loop? Like, who cares? Like, why would you ask that question? I work with senior developers who literally could not answer that question right now. There's interviews that ask you the dumbest questions that don't even make a difference in terms of like, can you build software and can you ship features? But yeah, I'm curious. What's your experience has been? Leave a comment below. If you enjoyed watching this, also feel free to join my Discord if you want to talk to me directly, or just help if you're stuck with coding or you just want someone to help you with whatever. I'm losing my voice. I'm kind of sick right now, so I'm going to wrap this up. Have a good day. Happy coding.